everyone, good evening, welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight for this special Scruton Hub event. I'm Solène Tadier. It will be my pleasure to lead tonight's conversation. So we are gathered here tonight to discuss a highly topical subject that is, alas, also not new, and that is the crisis of the faith in the West. The special motivation behind this event is the realization that we are at a crossroads in our history, and that only a proper understanding and awareness of what has brought us to where we are today can provide us with the necessary tools, the necessary keys to a more prosperous future. So we are convinced that the spiritualist, and that is the Christian approach to our Western societies, is fundamental in the sense that Christianity, whether we like it or not, many don't like this idea, but Christianity is the basis of our societies. And none of today's issues can be properly understood without such an approach. So that's why we're here tonight, and that's what we're going to do. And to do so, I'm tonight surrounded by two authors who are particularly well-versed in the matter. So ladies first, we'll say, right here we have a Danish journalist, Iben Trenholm, a visiting fellow at MCC, columnist, a very well-known public debater in Denmark. She's the author of a number of articles, essays on spirituality, a host of a podcast offering a Christian perspective on current affairs. And Rod Dreher, of course, who needs no introduction, American writer, currently the Budapest-based director of Network Project at the Danube Institute. Through a best-selling series of books, the first of which is The Benedict Option, that many of you may already know, followed by Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissident in 2020, and finally, his latest, Living in Wonder, Finding Mystery and Meaning in a Secular Age, that was published just a couple months ago, all of them translated in many languages already. Rod Dreher has been consistently providing Christians with tools, intellectual weapons, I would say, to survive the decay of post-Christian civilization. So without further ado, let's get to the heart of tonight's topic with maybe one straightforward, maybe complicated question, maybe, a question that would require a lot of time, but if you could answer quite briefly, if you were asked, how did we get there, and when did the erosion of Christian values really started in history? Where would you situate that, if you had to, both of you? Maybe Rod, if you have an idea.
Yeah, it's a bit academic to say, but I think that at the end of the High Middle Ages, that was the turning point, because it was then when the philosophical nominalist, that is William of Ockham, the Franciscan friar, who criticized the scholastics. And the nominalists believed that there is no ultimate meaning embedded in the material world, that the only thing that matters, the only reason that the material world matters is because we human beings project value onto it. Now, it sounds like a very small thing, but it has tremendous implications, because this started a long process. It wasn't only nominalism, but this laid the philosophical groundwork for the steady expulsion of God from our life. Ockham was a Franciscan. He loved God, and he thought he was protecting God. But over time, when we got to the scientific revolution and the Reformation, and then the Enlightenment, and on into the modern world, God became more and more remote from us, until today, when many people, we are disenchanted. We don't feel the presence of God around us. Or God, for many people, is just an idea. He's not a living presence. Now, I believe in God. I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I believe, as we say in our Orthodox prayers, that God is everywhere present and fills all things. So it's not that God has left us, but we have ceased to be able to see him, to perceive him. obviously there are still Christians among us. Many of you, no doubt, are people of faith. But I'm talking in general about our civilization. And I believe that Prime Minister Viktor Orban was right when he said that Western civilization is built on Christianity. If we don't recover Christianity in a real way, not just in a merely cultural way, then we're lost. But it started in the High Middle Ages, I think.
It's really something that you write about in your last book, Living in Wonder, and it's really like High Middle Age or Renaissance. We used to be at the peak of creation, and all of a sudden we became the center of universe, basically. We were not part of creation anymore. We were the center of universe, and the, yes.
Yeah, well, that's right, Celine. And there's a contemporary intellectual, an Israeli named Yuval Noah Harari. He's an atheist. He's very popular in Silicon Valley. He has a very neat phrase to describe what happened in the early modern period. He said, we in the West exchanged meaning for power. What he meant by that was we surrendered the idea that there is meaning embedded, logos embedded in all of creation, so we could take power over it and do what we wanted with the material world. Now, this led to many, many scientific discoveries. It led ultimately to the Industrial Revolution and to the prosperous world we have today. But the cost of that is what we're living with now, the meaning crisis. And I think that we can't resolve the meaning crisis, which comes down into a social crisis that we see all around us, unless we find a way to recover that meaning.
Any thoughts, Ben?
I totally agree with Rod that it all started in the Middle Ages. But I think now we see the results, and this is the mental health crisis. I come from Scandinavia, from Denmark, and recently, I mean, this is one of the most secular parts of the world. If you have a world list of the most secular countries, Denmark would rank as number 3. So people are very, very secularized. Denmark is, I would say, it is materialism. That is our philosophy, you could say, because we have the welfare state, so we believe that the state would provide no matter what's going to happen in your life. But recently, I was a guest at a youth club one night. It was a meeting for children and parents, because a lot of young people and school children today are suffering from anxiety and depression. So the theme was, the topic was how to combat anxious thoughts. And the speaker were telling these young people to believe in themselves, not in God, of course. They said, well, whenever you have a negative thought, it's just a thought. It's not reality. It's just a thought, she said. So whenever you feel anxious, just tell yourself that this is just a thought. And then we came to the Q&A session, and she stressed all the time, believe in yourself, and if you believe in things, things are gonna happen, you know, like they could, you know, perform miracles themselves. And then a mother asked a question. She said, my son is thinking about dying all the time. I don't know what to do. What should I tell him? And then the speaker said, oh, you just tell him that, you know, this idea that he's gonna die is just a thought, you know. And then the mother looked really desperate and said, I tried that, but it doesn't work. And that just opened up, you know, a lot of other parents saying, well, my son and daughter has the same problem. They're so afraid of dying, I don't know what to tell them. And then in the end, the speaker got really anxious herself and said, well, this is not really my topic. I'm not a professional, so I think you should go to see a psychologist. And then end of story, and then she continued, you know, encouraging people to believe in themselves. And I think this is very telling, because the whole idea that you can sort of, you can fix your life by just believing in yourself, it's a very prevalent thought. And I think this idea that I'm the center of the universe, and I have no idea about that my anxiety could be because that I completely lost the connection to God, which I think it is. I think the mental health crisis is really about that we lost the understanding of what original sin does to us. And psychology has sort of given us a false hope that we can fix our own broken nature ourselves. And this is, I think, one of the major problems in the modern world, is that psychology cannot help people. I know a very known Norwegian psychiatrist, and he was a speaker in Denmark at a church event, and he said, well, medical science has really prevailed in all areas except from psychiatry. Now we've seen that we are moving backwards because we can't help people. And I think it's because that psychology has completely rejected the idea that human beings has a soul. And the first reaction actually of Adam after he fell and he sinned, Adam and Eve, was that he got anxious. When God is looking for Adam and he says, where are you? Adam said, I was hiding because I was afraid of you. So anxiety is actually a kind of symptom that we are disconnected from God. And that's why I think, because psychology is overlooking this spiritual connection and that we have a soul, that so many people are suffering today. And I think it's a huge problem, and it has to do with the meaning crisis. So this is the result of that. It's only subjectivity. There is no objective truth. And I see the consequences in Denmark and Scandinavia, and also in the United States you have a mental health crisis. And I think it's really, really very sad to see that so many people are suffering today because they have distanced themselves from reality, the ultimate reality. And this is a huge problem, I think.
Yeah, and can I add to that? A couple of years ago in the US, I was talking to a teacher from high school. And she said when she started her career 15 years ago, she would have a student have a major meltdown, one or two students, an emotional meltdown, maybe once a term, a semester. Now she says it happens every week, you know, and this is a country where everybody is rich, many people at least are rich and comfortable and have all their material needs taken care of, and yet the kids are falling apart. I think if you go back to the Enlightenment and the late modernity, you see that the whole liberal project, and I mean liberalism not in the sense of left-wing politics, but just the way modern liberal democratic politics work, they've been driven by the idea that the point of liberalism is to liberate us, to free us from any unchosen obligation. You're free. Progress means you're free more and more to choose how you want to live, but nobody will tell you what to choose. You can choose yourself. Well, that sounds appealing to most of us. The problem is that you now have, in the 21st century, young people who can't decide whether they are male or female. I remember speaking a couple of years ago to a father, a Catholic father in Slovenia, who said he and his wife were very, very worried about their daughter. They had bought their daughter for her birthday a smartphone, because all the kids had a smartphone, but they weren't aware of what she could do with it. This girl connected with some older teenagers in the United States who started telling her about gender ideology. And this poor child, 11 years old, she was overwhelmed with anxiety. Am I the right gender? Am I choosing the right gender? And her parents would say, what are you talking about? You don't choose your gender. But this was the thought in her head that came to her through technology from the United States. And he said that she won't eat, she won't go to school, she's in deep crisis. I saw him a couple of years later. I said, how is your daughter, who is now 13? And he said, oh, it's worse. Now she's using drugs to help deal with her anxiety, marijuana. And I mean, this is just one little story, but the philosophical roots of this are in liberalism broadly considered, in the idea that there is no objective truth around which we should mold our lives and our sense of ourself, but rather we can choose anything, and our choosing will even has no limits in biology. I think this is going to be something we are going to see more and more with transhumanism. Transgenderism is the doorway to transhumanism. And I think also it is not an accident that the first generation with which transgenderism has taken off is the first generation raised only on the internet.
I would like to pick up on what you both just said, quoting a part of your last book, Living in Wonder, quoting the psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist. Am I pronouncing
Ian
it?
McGilchrist.
Yes, he claims that he claims that the very skills and habits that led to modern Western man to such material success have radically impoverished him spiritually and emotionally. They have washed away our sense of living in a world of wonder, meaning and harmony, and made us miserable. So it's a pretty much good summary of what you've both just said. If you want to add something to what this psychologist...
Yeah, and Ian McGilchrist is a psychiatrist himself, and he sees what's happening. McGilchrist is a really interesting man. He's British, and he sees that our entire civilization is breaking down. Now, he doesn't write from a religious point of view, but he says that civilization has a lot to do with brain hemispheres. We all know from neuroscience that the brain's right hemisphere is the side that takes in sensory impressions. It's the part that when we hear music or see beauty or pray or go to church, it comes first into the right hemisphere, which sends it to the left hemisphere. That's where the analysis happens. It's the abstract quality of the human brain. And then the analysis is sent back to the right hemisphere for integration. The problem, says McGilchrist, is in the modern era, like in the last 500 years, we in the West discovered that you can get lots of power if you live in the left hemisphere alone. If you see everything around you as having no ultimate meaning other than what you give it, and you can then start to exert control over it. And this has made us very rich, as he said, and technologically advanced. But in the end, we fail to see the whole truth. And we make ourselves sick, said McGilchrist, because of this. And we come to see that science and technology, not religion, but science and technology tells us about ultimate reality. McGilchrist has a wonderful phrase in his book, his latest book, in which he says, the modern world is like a man who takes a magnifying glass, you know, the big thing that helps you to see small things, looks into a puddle of water and sees life hiding there and says, that's wonderful, I can see this. And then he takes the glass and points it to the sky and says, I don't see anything, stars must not exist. His point is that science is wonderful at showing us certain things, but we make a very big mistake when we think that science can reveal to us ultimate truth. McGilchrist says that we have to go back to religion, to art, to beauty, to music, in order to have a more accurate picture of reality.
What is the antidote, even according to you? Would you add something?
Yeah, I totally agree that the biggest challenge also for the church is that people have moved so far away from reality, and that people do not know anymore what is reality. We have virtual reality, and it, of course, all goes back to the subjectivity that, you know, only what I believe has meaning or will exist in my own worldview. And that's a big, big challenge. And what I'm really worried about is that I see that nobody anymore know what is love, that we're very disconnected from true love. Love today is romanticism or sentimentalism. And I think that in a world where people do not know anymore what is God's love and do not even think that they would need God's love because they don't know what it is, because they're living in a total different reality, that is to me very demonic. It's very, very dangerous because people are simply out of reality. It means they're living in a separate world and creating a new kind of world which is not connected to reality. And I see more and more, the last half year I made a podcast which is entitled in Danish, Give God a Chance, where I invite an unbeliever to present a personal problem, and then even though the person is an unbeliever, they have a slight opening that God may help them with this problem. So then we open the Bible at random after I pray, and we start to talk about the problem. And I see that many people look into the faith as something beautiful, something they would like to achieve and be part of. But there is, at a certain point, they start to hesitate and they stop because they cannot give themselves to God. They don't want to make a sacrifice. They cannot surrender. And I think they don't understand what is the love they're being offered because they're living in a different reality. So they don't even see the idea, why should I need God's love? Because I want to take care of things myself. For instance, in Denmark, Stoicism has had a big revival. And Stoicism is actually about, building up your inner strength by virtues. There are certain things in Stoicism that would resemble Christianity because we also believe in a virtuous life. But the idea is I can take care of it myself. And that goes very well along with individualism, materialism, skepticism. I am my own God and I'm building myself.
And the sentimentalism, just from there, it's a kind of Rousseauization, Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, all these Enlightenment, the Lumière, where everything is only a sentiment, and everything is just what we feel.
Exactly,
no
exactly. The only world that is real is what I feel, and I see that it's a huge problem that people are so far away from God's reality that they might not even have an idea about how much they need God's love, and what kind of world would that be if people are totally disconnected from that reality?
And what do they consider God actually is? I mean, this is a huge problem in the United States, even among churchgoers. People have this idea that God is like a cosmic butler or a therapist, and you only need to talk to God if you need something. And God, the only thing he wants of us is to be happy and to be nice to other people. Well, I think God does want us to be happy and nice to other people, but there is so much more to God than that. But people don't understand it. We found in my church when I was living in Louisiana, before I moved to Budapest, after COVID, we started seeing a lot of young people coming to the Orthodox Church. And it was nice to see. There's not many Orthodox Christians in America, so we were happy to see them. And we would ask them, why are you here? Well, most of them came from evangelical megachurches. And they all told a similar story, that COVID scared them because it made them realize how quickly everything that they thought was normal and solid could fall apart. And they also came to believe that the sort of Christianity they were getting at the megachurch, which was very much like show business and full of therapeutic ideas about how to improve your life, five ideas for living a happier life, etc., that it wasn't going to make it through suffering. Eben is a specialist in the philosophy of Søren Kierkegaard, the great Danish 19th century Protestant theologian. Kierkegaard said something really important. He said lots of people admired Jesus, but Jesus didn't call admirers, he called disciples. And you can tell the difference between an admirer and a disciple when it comes time to suffer. And this is the point. We have become so comfortable and rich and safe in the Western world in recent decades after the war that a lot of people, as you say, don't think they need God. They think they can handle it themselves. And if they want to reach out to God, they're reaching out to God like, come help me in this way, be like my coach, but don't be my Lord, you know?
Yeah, that's true, that's true.
And it doesn't work.
No, I think because of our tendency towards subjectivity, like you said, God is just a butler, he's not the Lord. And I think what I'm trying to stress when I talk about God is the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of all wisdom. And if you don't have that kind of awe, if you don't have that kind of fear in a good way, it's not that you should be afraid of God, but that you should be so fearful losing your friendship with God that you would do everything to preserve it, and you will do everything to be in a relationship with God, because he is the ultimate source of love and he's your creator, and it doesn't really matter if you feel good or bad. That's just reality. And I think this is what we are losing even in the church, and that's something I'm very concerned about.
All of your remarks are very true, very powerful, but then when we think about that, we just, okay, we understand that the loss of faith is having an incredible impact on people's minds, but it's also having a huge impact on our culture, on what we're able to produce. You say like beauty could be a very powerful antidote to this crisis, but it seems also that with this loss of faith, this love, this dechristianization, we are no longer really able to propose beauty. It's something very difficult, and we see that youth is so thirsty for that. That's what brought you to the faith road in Chartres when you were a teenager. But right now, what do we have to offer? Sorry for making maybe a reference to Notre Dame as well, like that.
No, do, because we're all thinking about it.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that.
It reopened a few days ago, and it made me think, what are we able to offer to the world? We have wonderful craftsmen in France, but we used to be a nation with, you know, a reputation of great taste. We had the opening ceremony of the Olympics last summer, and now we have this, and we see like the craftsmanship is perfect, but then the new interior design for Notre Dame was heavily criticized. No one is seduced by that, and you had the liturgic vestments.
I think I actually was very surprised to see the altar, which looked like just a big trunk or something like that.
A lot of people compared it to some IKEA furniture, something. So is it? It seems that we are only able right now, because I don't want to be, to live in the past saying, oh, only what was done before was beautiful, and I'm too nostalgic, and it's not that, but it seems that also with the loss of faith and the loss of depth, we are no longer able to produce beauty. That sounds to be, some kind of curse.
Yeah, so Lynn is talking about how I first started my journey to Christianity. I was raised in a small town in Louisiana in the deep South. My family was Methodist, former Protestantism, but we didn't go to church very often, so I didn't have a strong Christian background. But when I was 17 years old, I didn't really believe in God. I thought Christianity was about nothing but social conformity. And then my mother won a trip in a contest to Europe, a guided tour. She didn't want to go, but she knew that her son wanted to see Paris and see where Ernest Hemingway lived, that sort of thing. So she sent me. I was the only young person on a tourist bus full of elderly Americans. I didn't care, I was going to Paris. On the way to Paris, the bus stopped at an old church 1 hour outside the city. And I didn't want to go in and see an old church, but I did anyway. And this was the cathedral at Chartres. There was nothing in my life growing up in the 1970s in small town America that prepared me for the glory of God made manifest in that medieval cathedral. And I remember standing there, and all of my doubts, I thought I was very intellectual about, God doesn't exist, but they all disappeared. I knew somehow that God was real and he wanted me. Now, I didn't walk out of there as a reconverted Christian, but I did walk out of there on a search that ended maybe 8 years later with my full conversion. And the conversion happened after I met a holy, very old Catholic priest. I was sent to interview him as a journalist. And he had found God again after being an atheist, after experiencing a real miracle. And then he came to the priesthood after having another miracle. And the old man was in his 90s then, and he was crying as he was telling me about these events that happened to him 50, 60 years ago. And I knew in that moment, too, it was like a repeat of the Chartres moment. I had so much more Christian theology in my head by then, but my heart wasn't converted. And so I knew when I stood up and left the interview that I had to surrender everything to Christ, and that's when I converted. Now, years later, I read that Pope Benedict XVI, who is one of my heroes, he said that in our time, the best apologetics, the best way we have to evangelize people is not with reasoned argument, because people don't want that anymore. Rather, it is through the beauty the church creates, whether it's the art and the music that come out of the Christian experience, or the saints, which is a form of moral beauty. When you see real holiness, as I did that day with that old Monsignor, it's very, very attractive. Encountering these things, said Benedict, opens the mind to consider the propositional truths of Christianity. And I think that's really true, but I wonder, Solène, to your point, who goes into a modern church and says, this was inspired? It doesn't have that feeling.
Exactly, that's a real issue, and it looks like really young people, and we see that with the incredible success of traditional mass, traditional stuff, traditional pilgrimage. Like in Chartres, for instance, you have a lot of international youth from around the world who are attending this pilgrimage, annual pilgrimage from Paris to Chartres, because they need beauty. And that's what we lack today. And what is interesting is that over 40 statesmen made the trip to Notre Dame. And I'm wondering, I think it's fair to wonder, would they have done the same trip for the Louvre Pyramid or even the Eiffel Tower? I'm not sure. It means that the beauty conveyed by Christianity is so unique. That's the strongest unifying architecture in the world, probably.
Yeah, but it's not just aesthetic beauty. It's aesthetic beauty that points beyond itself to God. Like I knew somehow, I was only 17 and I didn't have the intellectual vocabulary to understand Chartres, but I knew that that building had been raised 700, 800 years earlier by men whose names we no longer know, who built it out of a deep conviction that God is real. And this is a temple to the God that I didn't know, and that it is hard to have this. It's the same God that is worshipped in modern temples and churches today, but it's a lot harder to connect to him, it seems. And what people want is beauty, not just for aesthetic pleasure, but because beauty leads them to transcendence, to a connection with the living God and with a higher realm. What we're finding now, this really shocked me when I was researching my book, Living in Wonder. We're finding that the younger generation in the US, called Generation Z, in their late teens, 20s, they don't have any interest in atheism. Most of them don't. But they don't have an interest in Christianity either. What they're doing is turning to various forms of the occult and psychedelic drugs to get that sense of transcendence and mystery that they ought to be able to get in the church, but so many of us in the church have lost connection ourselves to it, even though we profess it.
So the reason why Christians' buildings monuments are so attractive to and able to unify people is because it conveys meaning. That's what you say, because true beauty, genuine beauty conveys meaning always. What do you think, Iben?
I think what is very important to remind ourselves is that it's not only the beauty and that we are able to construct or build beautiful art and buildings. I think it's also because God is dwelling within the Catholic Church and in the Orthodox churches, in the tabernacle. And I'm a convert to Catholicism, and I remember the first time that I was invited into a Catholic church. I was studying theology, so I was not totally coming from scratch. And I had a friend who was a Catholic, and he was going to give a birthday party. So he said, I would like you to come for Mass before the dinner, he said to all the guests. And I thought to myself, because I was raised in a very anti-Catholic environment, because Danish culture is very anti-Catholic. So I had absolutely no expectations. I just thought, okay, we're going to do this, so just get over with it so we can start, the dinner and the drinks. And when I entered the church, it's a quite small church, and today it's not far away from where I'm living. And they actually have the relics of Saint Andrew from Italy, one of the apostles. And I entered the church and I sat down, and I really, really had absolutely no expectations. It was just like any other service, I thought. But then after a short while, something happened to me I cannot explain. It was like I felt there was this presence of something so peaceful and so loving that knew me. I mean, that knew all my secrets and really had this kind of loving sort of embraced me. And I was so overwhelmed, so I could not help start crying, and I didn't want the other people, my friends from university, to see that I was in this state of I wouldn't say breakdown, but I was just so overwhelmed. And I couldn't figure out what it was. But it was like something that approached me that was so loving in a way I never tried before. So when I came back to my place that night, I was really wondering what happened to me. It was not that I was coming back to the Catholic Church, next Sunday, but it started a journey. And every time later on when I came to a Catholic church, I had the same experience. Sometimes when I was alone, I could feel that somebody was watching me or looking at me. And, I thought it was a little bit, not spooky, but I was just so overwhelmed. And then, of course, being a theologian, I started to read all the mystics, and I understand suddenly the theology behind the living presence of Christ in the Catholic Church, in the tabernacle and in the Eucharist. And then everything made sense. But I had the experience before I learned the theology, and I think that was something that really convinced me that this is the truth. And then, like you, I had to surrender. I had to say, this is the truth. I cannot anymore just being a Protestant, because the Protestants do not have the tabernacle in their churches. That's part of Luther's theology. So I think if you take people to church today, they might have that experience without not being prepared for it. And I think that is really, really very important if you have friends or people. And you don't know when God wants to give a person that experience, but it can happen. And I know a lot of converts who actually converted because they had this experience like I had. Tons of, millions of Catholics have had this experience. And I think that is something that can never be taken away, because that's ultimate reality. And as long as the church is open, we can still connect to that reality whenever we enter a church. And I think that's extremely important.
Yeah, but I should say too that it does, God can do what he wants with whoever he wants. And I tell a story at the beginning of my book, Living in Wonder, about this Protestant man I met in Jerusalem 2 years ago. I walked into a small jewelry store in the old city of Jerusalem to buy a memento. I was there for Orthodox Holy Week, and there was a man that looked a little bit rough at the back of the store. He was working on the accounts, and I was waiting for the owner of the store to come, and so he looked Western. I began to talk to him. His name was Ian, and he was from England. He had a very rough working class accent. I said, "How long have you been in Jerusalem?" 29 years. "Oh, why did you come here?" He said, "Looking for drugs." Like, wow, tell me about it. He said he was a junkie, addicted to heroin in London. He heard there were better drugs in Amsterdam, so he went to Amsterdam, found them there. Then he heard there were even better drugs in Tel Aviv, so he went to Israel. But then he began to realize, if I don't get off of drugs, I'm going to die. So he went to rehab twice. It didn't work. Finally, he said, I have one chance left. He was not raised a Christian, had no Christian background, but something told him to go sit on the banks of the Jordan River and just wait there. And either the withdrawal symptoms will kill him or he'll be free. Along the way, someone gave him a copy of the New Testament, of the Bible. He didn't know anything about it, but he sat down on the riverbank and began to read the New Testament. When he got to the story in one of the Gospels where Jesus was baptized in the Jordan, he said he noticed on the other side of the river there was a cloud forming on the ground, and the cloud began to move across the river towards him. As it got closer, it got thicker and thicker and thicker. Finally, it was on top of him. He said he could taste it. It was that thick, and he could feel it. And inside that cloud, he said, I felt the most intense love. I couldn't imagine there was love like that. And it told him that it loved him. He said, I had no idea how long I was in that cloud, but when it finally went away, 4 days had passed, and all of the craving for drugs was gone. He was hungry. He walked back to Jerusalem and begged on the street. An evangelical pastor said, brother, come to the mission. We'll give you something to eat. We'll give you a place to stay. And he did, and he was later baptized there. And he's been a Christian, an evangelical Christian, for all this time because of this miracle God gave him. So I just walked off the street in Jerusalem and heard this story, and it became one of the top stories in the book. Because this is how our God is, you know, if we're open to it. And this man was open to it. There was something that told him, go to the River Jordan and wait.
Yeah, I'm sure that a lot of people have those personal experiences where God is real. But I think still it's very important to hold on to the sacramental truth, because this is objective truth. Whenever I go for Mass, it doesn't really matter how I feel. And I don't go for Mass because I want to feel good. I do it because I know it is the truth. So even though God can give us those wonderful moments where he appears to us or where we have fantastic feelings, it's very important that there is an objective truth that you can always consult, you can always go to the source, no matter how you feel, and it doesn't matter if you feel good or bad, because it's just there and it's real. And whenever I go for Mass, it's not about my feelings, it's about worshiping God. And I think this is because we're living in an age where personal experiences and how I feel is so central to many people. So I think that to be very focused on the liturgy, as you are also as an Orthodox, that's something that is very important, because it's not really dependent on our feelings at all. It is just there and it's real.
But we've reached the perfect definition of what you call wonder, enchantment. That's the belief that the awareness that we live in a reality where there is deep meaning, a meaning that exists independent from us, right?
That's right, that we can know, not simply in our heads, in an abstract way, but know with our bodies. Mm-hmm. And this is where I want to push back a little bit on even. I think you're absolutely right. There is objective truth there in the liturgy, from a Catholic or an Orthodox perspective. But it's also the case that we are incarnate beings, that we need to have a sense that, feelings aren't all bad, and not just feelings, but perception. I'll give you an example. When I converted to Christianity, I came in as a Catholic and lost my Catholic faith 13 years ago after the abuse crisis. I went through a terrible crisis. Part of the reason that I wasn't strengthened as a Catholic was I knew what the Catholic Church taught, and I believed it. But living in America, whenever I would go to the services, I didn't see any of it reflected. I was so Protestant as a Catholic in the sense that I see nothing here around me that reflects the truth of what Catholicism teaches. I knew the Eucharist was real, and so I kept going, because the Eucharist God is truly present in the Eucharist, even though nothing else was there. But with his modern languages and things like that, modern hymns. But I finally couldn't believe it anymore. In the Orthodox Church, and I'm not here to argue Orthodox versus Catholicism, but I can at least say that when I went into the Orthodox Church, the fact that it has retained a lot of the old liturgy and the sense of transcendence. The Eucharist is still the Eucharist. If none of that was there, it would still be the Eucharist. But in my own weakness as a human being living in the flesh, I was able to better prepared to see the truth of Christ in the Eucharist, because we had all this beauty around us, beauty in music, beauty in art. The Catholic Church has this too, but in the modern times, it has thrown so much of it away, it seems.
For me, being brought up as a Protestant and studying Protestant theology in Copenhagen and Søren Kierkegaard, it is a relief to me that that the Catholic Church is not depending on any human beings, that it is actually the presence of Christ and his living presence in the Eucharist. For instance, in Denmark, there is such a focus on the priest's performance, whether he's doing good homilies and
in the Protestant church.
Whether he's sort of entertaining and how he can attract a huge church community and things like that. But in the Catholic Church, it doesn't really matter if a priest is giving a good homily or not. I'm happy if the homily is good, but I come to the Mass to receive Christ himself in the liturgy. And that, for me, is essential. And this old joke, there is this story about Napoleon, the emperor, the French emperor. He said to a Catholic priest, "I want to destroy the Catholic Church." And then Napoleon said, the priest said to Napoleon, "I'm sorry, Napoleon, that's not possible, because the Catholic priest has tried to do that for 1800 years and they haven't succeeded yet." So it means that there is something to the Catholic Church that is not touched by man, and also the Orthodox Church, because we are in this apostolic succession. And I think for me that is essential. It does not depend on whether the Pope is a sinner and he's saying terrible things, or if we have bad priests, because the gates of hell shall never prevail. And for me, this is enough.
What do you say about the new cathedral that's opened in Berlin, St. Hedwig's? They've just redesigned it. It looks like a whitewashed tomb. They've taken everything off that would tell you this is a Catholic church, and barely even a Christian church. Now, if they say Mass there as a Catholic, of course Christ is really there in the Eucharist. But it seems that if one just walks into the church, there's nothing in that church to convey in the body, to the senses, what's happening there.
Yeah, but in many monasteries, for instance, Trappist or Carmelite monasteries, you would see churches that resembles also Protestant churches with white walls, not many images. At least in Denmark, we have a new Carmelite monastery, and it's sort of the same. I don't like it so much because I like beauty, but still, as long as there is a tabernacle, I'm fine.
Interesting conversation, but we could continue for a while. But speaking of monasteries, what I think is an interesting point, like the solution, what concretely can be done. And it's true that Catholics can be at fault sometimes because we've been rejecting miracles a lot. We have this kind of rationalism that doesn't affect Orthodox that much. But of course, the Protestants, the very idea of a miracle is most of the time associated with the devil. And the Catholics themselves have sometimes made it a point of honor to reject even the presence of angels. I had a very good interview with the rector of Mont Saint-Michel recently, and he was telling me we need to re-evangelize the world with that, like with the invisible world. And even the Catholics themselves tend to reject the invisible world and the very notion of miracle. And so all this re-enchantment that should be done, it's starting somehow maybe to happen again, because one first sign that I see is the revival of monasteries. Monasteries have basically shaped Europe. Big cities were built around monasteries. And of course, Rod, it's a topic you know well with the Benedict option. Is it something that you're also witnessing? Yeah, we know La Lucerne in Normandy, a brand new project to rebuild communities, to give people a sense of hope and to rebuild proper Christendom. And it was inspired by your book. I wrote a piece about that, La Lucerne Abbey in Normandy. What are your thoughts? Are you seeing maybe a change, a shift?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. My new book, Living in Wonder, was published at the same time in the US and in the UK. I have had an equal number of journalists and podcasters in the UK wanting to interview me as in the US. Now, the US is much more Christian than the UK is in terms of Christian practice, and yet something is happening in England. And I've said this to a couple of English Christian journalists I know. I said, this is so strange that, you know, in godless England, they're interested in the book. And they've said to me, there's something happening. It's not making it into the mainstream media yet because journalists don't know Christians, but we're seeing a lot of young people, especially young men, coming into the church and seeking something very deep and mystical. You know, some are coming into the strong Anglican parishes they find, some are coming into Catholicism, others into Orthodoxy, but they want something deep, something that is not going to condescend to them and tell them that this is merely therapeutic. And I think that the reason I chose to write this book about St. Benedict and what he has to teach us today in the modern world is I believe we are living in a time that can be compared to the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, where the civilization is running out of steam, running out of energy. St. Benedict of Nursia emerged from that collapse, and all he wanted to do was to figure out how one could live in faithful Christian community in the ruins. He wrote the Rule of St. Benedict. By the time he died in the year 547, he had founded 12, maybe 13 monasteries, and that would have been a wonderful thing if that's all he did. But it turns out in the Middle Ages, monasticism took off. Well, it became hugely popular. And the Benedictine monks spread all across Europe, and they laid the groundwork eventually over time for the refounding of Western civilization. I think they have something to say to us today, not just Catholics, not just Orthodox, but all Christians, about how we who live in the world and who aren't going to leave the world, but how we can build stronger Christian communities, stronger devotional lives in ourselves, and become more resilient and faithful even in a post-Christian and even anti-Christian world. And it all goes back to the monasteries. Here's something interesting, though. You know, Solène, that I have a real devotion to the monastery in Norcia, the town in Umbria in the mountains where St. Benedict was born. I'm an Orthodox Christian, but Benedict is an Orthodox saint too, as all of the saints pre-schism are. Those monks are doing great. Their monastery was closed by Napoleon, but reopened 200 years later by an American monk, Benedictine monk, and a couple of his followers. Now they have so many vocations. They're devoted to the traditional Mass and traditional Benedictine spirituality. I was there once a few years ago, and I asked a monk, how many monks do you have here? They said 20, something like that. I said, how many are at, what's the mother house of the Benedictines, the Italian, it's slipping my mind now. Monte Cassino, yeah. How many are at Monte Cassino?
Beautiful place to visit.
Yeah, they said 4. 4 monks at Monte Cassino, the headquarters. Now, I didn't want to embarrass the monk by asking him why, but I asked Italian Catholics I know, and they said because so many of those monks became so modern and so liberal, the monks at Monte Cassino, and they lost the salt, yes. Right? But it exists in this small monastery in Norcia. We need to go find those monasteries and see what we can learn where the Lord is really obeyed and celebrated, and they're trying to be faithful to God, not to the world.
And they're also helping people around, like it is the case in Norcia. It is the case now in La Lucerne or in Boulor, this beautiful Cistercian abbey that was completely resurrected, like in the model of the Middle Age. The thing is that these areas where there is a lot of rural life and people are considerably impoverished, these monasteries can be again an economic force as well, a cultural hub, and that's what they want to be. So it's a very interesting renewal in all that. I don't know if it's something, you are a Scandinavian even, but there also seem to be a kind of very interesting renewal in Sweden, for instance, in Norway, where faith and traditional faith, which is very surprising because they were at the forefront of dechristianization. And that's also the countries where the youth is attracted to the faith and to traditional faith most of the time. Yeah,
sure. And I read that in France, this year there were an increasing number of young people getting baptized. So the French bishops were quite surprised to see that kind of increase of people who wanted to become Catholics. And I think there is something going on. But I give a lot of talks among Christian circles, and I think the biggest problem for us Christians in the West is fear. Most Christians are, sort of reluctant to stand up for the faith because they're so used to be intimidated by secularism, so they don't really want to risk anything. We're very complacent, we're very spoiled, so people are, being held back by fear. And I think we are facing a time where we have to get rid of that fear, and we have to be more courageous, because Islam is growing a lot, even though we see, people coming back to the traditional Christian faith. Just if you look at demography, you would see that within 50 years, a large part of Europe would be Islamic. So if we don't convert Muslims into being Christians and is trying to get rid of that fear to give Islam competition. And also in the Nordic countries, there is a revival in paganism. The old Viking religion is very popular. So I think Christianity needs to compete more with other religions, and we have to, get rid of that embarrassment or that kind of fear that we are so used to because we have been so intimidated by secularism for so many years. So it all comes down to whether people would, like you started out saying, Rod, sacrifice and become martyrs in the sense that they want to witness no matter what are the costs, because that has always been the way Christianity prevailed, even in the Roman Empire.
But is it possible without a sense of wonder? Like, if, can we really, put our skin in the game if we don't?
No, I would say also love, and that's why I think it's so. It's so sad that we have lost, the love of God, because, modern priests have been preaching for decades that God loves you, and you cannot do anything that God cannot forgive, and everything is all right, God loves you, and He does, but you also have to love God. The first commandment is to love God with all your soul and with all your heart. So that kind of love for God, I think we have lost that.
But we also lost this kind of manifestation.
And you won't be able to do a sacrifice if you don't love God. If you don't do it for God, you won't be able to do it. So I think, and that's what I think you can learn through the liturgy and through, relating to objective truth, which is love, which is peace, which is unity. I think you have to be very strongly connected to that to be able to make a sacrifice, because another thing we don't talk about in Western Christianity is the afterlife. We are very concerned about saving the culture. We're not concerned about saving our souls for the next life. We're not talking about that. And the reasons why Christians in the Roman Empire would give their lives was because they were totally convinced that they will have eternity with Christ. We don't talk about that aspect anymore. It's only about saving a culture. Christ did not ask us to save the culture. He asked us to follow Him and save our souls, or let Him save our souls. And I think we need to go back to that afterlife, eternity perspective as well.
That's the role of miracles as well. Is
to
evangelize people. Did you want to
I wanted to say that when I worked on my last book, Live Not by Lies, it's a story about what Christians who lived under communism, including some here in Hungary, the message they have for Christians in the West on how to deal with wokeness and the increasing anti-Christian persecution in the West. And all of them, every single one, whether it was Russia, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, wherever, they all said the most important thing to cultivate is a willingness to suffer. And as you were saying, Céline, it's very hard to give your own life up or give your job up or give your reputation up if you don't really believe that God is real and that there's this transcendent realm is real and there will be consequences to it. I tell a story in the book about this amazing Russian Christian, Alexander Ogorodnikov. He was raised in a prominent communist family in the Soviet Union, but in the early 1970s, so many people of his generation no longer believed in the ideals of communism. He became a Christian, an Orthodox Christian, and began drawing people, young people, also disillusioned, to his apartment there in Moscow. Of course, the KGB was watching him, especially because he came from a prominent communist family. And they ultimately arrested him and everybody else and sent them to prison. Because he came from a well-known communist family, they put him on death row. Even though he did not have a death sentence, they wanted to make an example of him. So he went in there and began to evangelize the worst prisoners in all of Russia. Some of them converted. The warden of the prison was so angry at him for his conversions that he put him in solitary confinement, and they beat him and tortured him. When Alexander told me this story in a hotel in Moscow in 2019, part of his face was paralyzed from the beatings the guards gave him. Eventually, Alexander began to lose his faith in the prison, in that cell. He said, "God, why have you brought me here? Have you abandoned me?" And then one night, he told me, he was awakened by someone putting their hand on his shoulder, and it woke him up. It was an angel. And the angel showed him a prisoner from behind being taken to his execution. These were death row prisoners, right? And he had his hands cuffed, and the guards had him. And Alexander couldn't understand why this was happening. This kept happening night after night with different prisoners. Finally, Alexander understood it. He was being shown the fate of men he had witnessed to and who had accepted Christ, had come to Christ and confessed the faith, who were going to their execution for the murders they committed, but they were going to be in paradise with the Lord. And Alexander regained his faith in a very profound way there. Now, I tell that story in the book because, A, it's a good story, but it also shows that even those of us who are so devout, we can be put under such terrible conditions, like being beaten and tortured, where we might be tempted to lose our faith. But for Alexander, it was this extraordinary revelation from the Lord that it's all real, and the things that you did, Alexander, in witnessing to these men, they were going to heaven. They died and went to heaven because I, the Lord, put you there as my witness. I love stories like that, and I wanted the readers of my book to get the same sense that I did in hearing them, that these people who have this deep, strong belief in the afterlife, in the reality of the transcendent, they're the ones who find the strength to resist.
And it goes hands in hands with the reality of evil as well, of the devil. It's also a big taboo, even in the Catholic Church right now. You have an increasing number of priests who even deny the existence of the devil. And maybe the awareness of a spiritual battle is also something that brings a lot of strength and that reawakens a lot of faithful.
Well, a lot of Catholic priests cannot keep up with the demand of people who need an exorcist. I know that because some years ago I was studying demonology in Rome, in one of the pontifical universities, and we have some of the most prominent exorcists from the Catholic Church teaching. I even had an interview with Father Gabriel Amort, which was very interesting. And
was the exorcist of the Vatican. Just for those who don't know, he was very famous Italian exorcist in Rome, and he's dead now. He died a few years ago.
Actually, there is a Hollywood movie now with him called The Pope's Exorcist.
Russell Crowe.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not Father Amort at all. But no matter what. But it was really interesting because it seems that many people today are dealing with occult spiritualities. And suddenly, you know, they feel evil is really, you know, sort of taking control of their lives. And they cannot get rid of that themselves. So they need to go and see a priest. And there is, I mean, Pope Francis had to appoint even more exorcists because they cannot keep up with the demand. So it tells us that spiritual realities are real. I mean, it's something that is happening.
It's not a joke. You're right about
exactly.
that.
Exactly. And you're also writing about that in your book. And I think that's, you know, actually I would encourage anybody to speak to an exorcist just for half an hour, because that would change your perception of reality, because what they can tell you is actually for real. And I think many modern people do not know how much they can get attacked by demonic powers. Father Gabriel Amort told me that it's of course very normal that modern man thinks that all his thoughts are his own, but that's not the case. I mean, the devil can slip a thought into your mind and suggest things to you and tempt you. And other exorcists would explain how that demonic powers can control our emotions. That's why it's very dangerous to build your life only on your emotions, because you don't know who's controlling your emotions. So it's a whole, you know, world that we are being influenced by, that we don't see, but it's real. And many people today are just the toy of the devil because they're not praying. If you don't pray, you will just be the toy of the devil, and he can do whatever he wants to you. And I think that's also part of the mental health crisis, is because so many people are living sinful lives. They never go for confession. They don't know what sin can do to their psyche, and they don't know anything about what they're really dealing with. Because whenever you sin, an exorcist would explain to you, then the devil has sort of a right to, you know, influence you, or has a right over you, like some kind of legal right. Whenever you sin, you will enter the devil's domain, and he will get more control over your life. So if you never go for confession, you ever ask for forgiveness, you can be in trouble, and you can get all sorts of problems in your life. That's quite real.
Yeah, and it's so true that our culture has become so influenced by the occult in incredible number of ways, and it is also true in the Catholic Church that they have had such a demand for exorcists. In my church, the Orthodox Church in the United States, I know 2 exorcists, and one of them is my confessor, and he has said openly that we are doing a very poor job in American Orthodoxy by not paying attention to that. Orthodox Christians believe in the demons, And I've seen that they have actual exorcisms in Russia and Romania and the traditional countries. It could be that in America we had the Orthodox came as immigrants at a time when they wanted so badly to assimilate and not be thought of as weird, exotic people. Whatever the reason, we need more of them. An Orthodox friend of mine told me, a layman, said that at his cathedral church, they were seeing in recent years more and more young Americans, especially men in their 20s, coming out of paganism. They had been worshiping Odin or some other pagan deity, and they were broken because they learned it was demonic, and they needed the help of the church. But the priests had no idea how to deal with them because this is so new in American culture. You know, these priests were formed in a time when the big enemy of the church was atheism or secularism, but now it's the occult. Young people get it, but the older ones of my generation and older really are living in a false sense of reality in that sense. The spiritual warfare is very real. An exorcist I know in Rome told me that there's no such thing as a spiritual vacuum. You know, that wherever Christianity recedes, the darkness will go farther.
That's so true. That's so true.
Yeah. And it's also true for Europe too. You know, Europe can't be just secular. If there's no Christianity, then Islam will also continue.
Exactly. Or paganism or occult spirituality would enter that spiritual void. And I think Islam is really trying to conquer that void. Just in the United Kingdom, there are now 50 cities that has a Muslim mayor. 50 cities with a Muslim mayor, and of course it's all, you know, Islam by democracy. It's because they have voted for this, and because they're getting more children than we do, of course the population would slowly get more and more Islamic, so it will be done by democracy and democracy or demography. So I think that's why we need to start to give Islam more competition and not be afraid.
Yeah, despite this renewal of the faith across Europe and in the West in general, it looks like politically they are not very, you know, Christianity politically is not very, you know, successful. It's not something that make you win election. So that's for sure. But I would like to ask maybe just one last open questions. We had this very famous writer, André Malraux, who was also used to be the Minister of Culture in France. He was atheist, left-winger, and he said, the 21st century will be a religious one, or it won't be at all. And that's an atheist intellectual who said that. What are your thoughts?
Well, similarly, Karl Rahner, the liberal Jesuit theologian, said that the 21st century, the Christian of the 21st century must be a mystic, or he won't be at all. And I think the two statements are compatible, that materialism has reached the end of the line, that we now know that secular materialism can provide us with all kinds of things, but it can't provide us with a reason to live and a reason to live in community. So we will have to turn back to God or to some sense of the transcendent. If we Christians cannot offer people an encounter, a life-changing encounter with the true God, then they will go elsewhere for it. They will go to Islam, they will go to the occult, they will go somewhere. But the world is re-enchanting now, whether we like it or not. The question is, what form will it take? We have to go back, I believe strongly, whatever our Christian confession is, we have to go back to mysticism. Tom Holland, the British historian who wrote this amazing book called in English Dominion, about how Christianity made the West. He was asked recently about cultural Christianity. Is that enough? No, he said. He said the church needs to lean heavily into the supernatural, because that is the one thing the church can give people that no government, no NGO, no charity can give them, a sense of connection with the supernatural. No, it's hard to say anything, to add anything to what Rod just said, but I think it's really true, and I think it is already quite religious, because we have Islam and we have all these occult practices, which is actually old pre-Christian spiritualities that has just been revived. So I think for the Christians it's crucial to get rid of the fear
because we have everything that people really need, but for some reason we are reluctant to talk about it and to show it and to stand up for it. So I think it is really very important not to be fearful and just be very courageous and just really be more loud about what we can offer people in the or what the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church and what the Orthodox Church can offer people.
On that point, I want to add something, and maybe you can help me understand this, Solène. When the Benedict option was published, the first country outside of America that published a translation was France. I went to France in 2018 to promote the book. I found that everyone I talked to was Catholic, and I found that the Catholics who are my age, I was 51 then, my age and older had lots of problems with it. They thought it was too radical, too separatist. The Catholics I met who are age 40 and under, they had no problems at all. They loved it. They wanted to know more about it. And those 40 to 50 were in the middle. And I couldn't figure it out. Finally, I had the idea that the Catholics my age and older still had this bourgeois idea that, oh, if we just change a little bit here, a little bit there, then Catholicism will appeal to France again. We can still be part of things. But the younger Catholics, the Catholics of your generation, Solène, all they cared about was, how can we serve God as Catholics fully? We don't have any care anymore to be part of the power structure. We just want to serve the Lord. Do you think I'm right about that, or is...
Totally. It's really, and figures show that, they attest to that. There is this renewal that we see in some Scandinavian countries as well, but in France it's very pregnant. You see, it's very manifest. You see a lot of young people attending this huge pilgrimage from Paris to Chartres every year. They have to refuse a lot of participants every year, like thousands of them are not allowed. And it's, because they are looking for something more demanding. I think they've really reached the limit of materialism, of self-reliance, and they are much more open to wonder, to enchantment, to the wonder of the faith. And so that's why it is quite encouraging, and that's something that is really happening. There is one last phenomenon I would say mention it in Lille, in northern France. There is this big church that is gathering every week, every Tuesday, if I remember correctly. It's like 900 students every week for a candlelight mass. So at night, at 10 p.m., where students, because they study first, and then they flock to the church at 10 p.m. on Tuesdays, and for a candle mass, like it's completely dark and just candles. And the beauty of the liturgy, the sense of wonder is what is attractive to them. And 900 people, like every week, and in France, like a very, very de-Christianized country.
And no fear of society's judgment. They know society will judge them, but they don't care. These Catholics who are my age and older, they had more of a stake in being respected by their secular colleagues. But the others, the young ones, they just didn't care. And I found that so inspiring.
Yeah, totally. Would you like to add one last word before we close this conversation and have a...
No, let's take some questions.
Yeah, so unfortunately this fascinating conversation is coming to an end.